Great. Well, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are very excited to be having a conversation on kind of the future of esotericism, and specifically, I think the exciting thing tonight is that we're going to be talking about the future of the Institute for Hermetic Studies Endowment Fund. Is that accurate to say, Mark? Is that
That sounds about right. That's
yeah?
it.
And in the framework of that, though, kind of in the broader framework of where is esotericism going in terms of an institutional and organizational practice? How does the IHS function within that? And what is the IHS do is kind of an example, right, for what organizations can do going forward as we try to kind of stabilize um, teaching practices, for the future. Does that seem?
I think that's really what we're talking about is the stabilization of teaching practices. When we hear within the various spiritual communities, and as we know, they've always been tangential to other movements and counterculture movements, um, as well as not so counterculture movements. So that part gets lost in the 20th, in the later half of the 20th century. Uh, is the notion of sustainability. What is sustainability? And within esotericism, that's continuity of teachings and practice and continuity across generations. And that's what we call tradition. And tradition can have a very wide or a very narrow sense to it, depending on how we're talking about it. We can talk about traditionalism as a broad philosophical view. We can talk about kind of a general notion of what constitutes Western esotericism. It's really esotericisms. But within that framework, we would say Hermeticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, astrology. That would be safe to say. And then we can get into more narrow branches of particular aspects of astrology, particular aspects of Kabbalah or alchemy or Rosicrucianism. Or even we can get into the lengthy question of where does Freemasonry fit into all of this, if at all, and in what way. So the notion of tradition is essentially that of continuity. And the reason continuity is important is because it's what we like to use the phrase now, it is institutional memory.
Right.
It is what you bring as a group experience. And then that group experience is somehow synthesized and transmitted forward to future generations, who then hopefully will add to it in a reasonable manner so that it has identifiable characteristics across generations. And that's what we say is another part of tradition. There has to be identifiable characteristics.
Which I think, a lot of the things you're bringing up is something that is widely missing across the culture. Um, you have a lot of trends right now, and probably for the past decade plus, as the internet has grown up, where that sense of continuity is really being disrupted, in terms of just the amount of information that's out there, the amount of the ability to go out and sort of cherry pick, you know, um, the quick changes in trends, what's popular this month, what's, that just sort of the churning through and a very aesthetic focus as opposed to a sort of practice oriented and continuous focus, right? Like there's a lot of Instagram feeds with beautiful altars and graphic design, but what's behind that? I mean, is there actually something behind that? You know?
Well, that's what we're looking at is, what is practice? What is the purpose of this? Where does a practice or a teaching come from? How do you do it? And what can you expect from it? These are the three basic things that constitute a practice. And that's of any kind. If you were to go to a gym, you would find out, okay, well, where does this exercise come from? How do I do it? And what can I expect from it? And the same thing with a martial art or how to play an instrument. You name it, that's the three basic fundamentals. And we often seem to skip that in contemporary a culture. And I use that term specifically because we're moving away from the occult, which of course means hidden, into this very open display of symbols associated with the occult, symbols and occasionally words and terms and sometimes ideas, although very rarely. And we're seeing it across all aspects of media. And what we end up with that is a look at for the commonality. What is the lowest common denominator that the audience will recognize? And then, of course, what is the commonality across ideas? Because no single group is often big enough. So we have to go for that common approach. So we see that also in the study of comparative religion, which is acceptable. We see that in the study of comparative psychology, was acceptable. And even in the study of comparative esoteric practices or anything, it's acceptable. However, when we reduce things to the lowest common denominator and strip them of sometimes their cultural aspects or other traditional aspects, what we end up doing is, as someone said to me once, ascorbic acid isn't vitamin C. Vitamin C is the totality of everything that you get. And what they meant was, of course, the important part of vitamin C was not just the vitamin C itself, but the totality of all of the other active elements that you get when you eat an orange or when you drink grapefruit. And what we do is we take it down to this reductionistic approach. And while that can have beneficial aspects in terms of understanding what the function is, it can be terribly damaging in terms of us understanding what is important.
Right. And without some sort of institutional through line, it's hard for individuals to have that, you know.
Well, that goes back to the notion of occultism at one time was institutional at various times.
Right.
And then when it becomes counterculture, it gets hooked in with the notion of anti-institutional. And that anti-institutional thread was wonderful at creating a wide marketplace. And of course, I use that specifically, that term marketplace, a wide audience. But what it essentially means is that for about 40 years now, maybe 50, but really about 40, the main audience has been primarily, adolescents and 20-year-olds. And occultism has a primarily adolescent viewpoint, even when you move beyond that, even when you move into 30 and 40-year-olds. You didn't see that at the turn of the century or even in the 20s and 30s, when there were very few occult movements around. The only people who could belong to them were adults, because you had to pay dues, and the average age was often in the late 30s, early 40s, when you get to see some of those statistics. So what we see is a problem with authority manifesting itself in a lot of these movements. And with that, the inability to establish or maintain healthy institutional structures.
Yeah, and also the the culture in general acting to destabilize the institutions that do, kind of stick around, because you see that with the sort of legacy institutions in occult practice have all become destabilized by you know, the digital age. I mean, you think of Golden Dawn in the 19th century, right? And then Golden Dawn now, it's a completely different, it's a totally different animal,
Well, they wouldn't even recognize it. I mean, the Golden Dawn in the 19th century, at its height, had around 350 members.
Right.
And you paid a fairly high amount of dues. I just saw today, I was looking at what was spent on the building of the Vault of the Adepti. And I took it and I translated it from, is that the right word? From British pounds in that period to British pounds now, and then that into American dollars now. And, the approximate cost of money spent was somewhere in the area of $1,400.
Right.
but you see one of the lodges having surplus funds of around $10,000.
Right.
Now, all of this was, and when you got your initiation, I mean, that was, some fee was attached to that, but even if there wasn't, there was a fee attached to the lessons that you got, which you would then copy by hand and then return the original.
Right.
I mean, I want that to sink in. It's like almost like when Frater Albertus gave classes, he never gave handouts. You had to write everything down, not even diagrams. You had to draw the diagrams yourself. That is the way it was done. Now, of course, there are problems with various Golden Dawn structures, as we know, but that meant that the people who were involved at that time were all professionals that we hear of, many of them fairly wealthy. Not everyone, but enough of them. They were solid middle class, upper middle class professionals, almost all of them that we seem to have any record of. And that is different today. Not to say that they have problems, clearly with the Great Break with Crowley and all of that, but and with the other organizations too, the Martinists in France and across the world, or their Great War of the Roses, there were of course issues there. But there the notion was about institutional structures often and the direction to take them.
Right.
It wasn't a question of how are you going to teach. It was a matter of, how is this going to be led, which is a leadership issue in some ways, well, in every way.
Right.
Now we have people who think that, and the good people stayed behind, and a lot of good people did their work after those splits. They didn't get involved, as often happens even today. But there was still a continuity that we look to. We look back to even those fragmented groups, and we want to read their archives. We want to know what they did. We want to see what their rituals were like.
And that exists to some extent, right? Because there was an institutional system to break up. And it's still, like you said, some people stuck by, and other people moving outside of that still continued with the thought of maintaining that material. I mean, there was still someone to have it. that doesn't always necessarily happen.
Well, that's right. That there was someone to have it, and that's otherwise the whole Regardi issue would never have happened. He would never been able to publish anything.
Right.
And we see that many of the archives that were in existence came into the possession of the United Grand Lodge of England. They were donated there. So there was always a place to put stuff.
Right.
There was a repository of some sort. There was a structure or institution of some sort that could act as the filing cabinet, if you will, for many of these groups and orders.
And to maintain its functional body of literature, functional body of practice, where I think you had mentioned the other day about the Mellon family donating the alchemical manuscripts to Yale, right? So Yale has a collection of alchemical manuscripts that's probably one of the best in the world, but where does that go to? It's in a special collections library where you have to have special access. You'd have to, if you actually wanted to use those practically, you couldn't just show up at Yale and be like, hey, I want to check out your alchemical books. And if you did, no one there would necessarily be able to guide you in what they meant.
Well, that's it. And the same thing with Harvard. I mean, Harvard's library initial alchemical holdings came from the Winthrop family, the governors of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And we see that, of course, even locally, our great fellow, who was it? Our famous doctor from Wallopin. His name escapes me at the moment. I was on that video with him, or about him. But all of his archives. Where did they go after his organization fell apart? Well, his personal papers ended up at Harvard. Right. They didn't stay locally. They didn't go to the local historical society. The local historical society probably wouldn't even want anything to do with them. Wouldn't have known what to do with them. So we have a profound issue here in terms of sustainability and continuity, just across one generation to another. The fact that the Institute for Hermetic Studies has lasted 20 years, over 20 years, I don't say is a minor miracle, but it says a great deal about the amount of time and dedication I and others put into it. And the question is why? Is why because we feel that this is important, that these ideas and these teachings are essential to our becoming as full human beings, and that they need to be presented in a manner that is useful to others, coherent and useful and applicable, and that has to be done across generations. Not just an organization that comes, produces a body of literature, and then disappears into the archives of history. And that's a new phenomena. That's a 20th century phenomena, but it is a reflection of the mercurial nature of occultism in the later half of the 20th century. Well, and now the first quarter of the 21st century. Whereas previously, yes, that mercurial element was there, Hermes is there, but there was always a notion of continuity and projection. There was a Jupiterian big picture involved.
Well, and also different aspects of Hermes, right? I mean, Hermes as a messenger, as opposed to Hermes as in the mercurial sense of being, disillusion and sort of moving apart. It's more of it's interesting the way that it's changed, and I think that in and of itself is something that should be taken note of and worked with. How do we? Because I mean, that's really the question here is it's finding the tools and the methods for creating the sustainability. It's not a matter of just giving into the tides of the disillusion, but how do we work within the structure right now? Because we have these great communication tools, right? I mean, we can meet across the globe now with Zoom and video conferencing and all the rest of it, but how how is that being utilized? How is that being utilized to also have the physical structures, the real world structures that can last and sustain teachings in that, and to actually have the valuable conversations too that need to happen.
Well, that's the coagulate part. How do we coagulate something? Okay,
Yeah.
so we've broken it up, we've dissolved it, we've made our solution, but have we solved the problem?
Right.
Okay, so what do we end up with in the end? What are we building? And the adolescent view of magic is it's all about me.
Right.
It's about what I can get out of it, what I can experience. It's not about what does this do? How do I become a better person? How do I become more? Or what is my obligation and my responsibility? What is my responsibility to the people who came before me that make this possible? When I buy the book on the used book market for $6, there's no feeling of responsibility even to the author. And we see that with the widespread theft of material on different websites. But then that obligation is, what is my obligation to my fellow workers on the path, my fellow household of the faithful, if you will, practitioners? Well, I don't have any, so there's no connection there. What is my feelings of my obligations to the future generations, children and grandchildren? I don't even think about those. What, children, grandchildren, what? So there's that isolation takes place, and the only way we overcome that is by recognizing the highly mercurial aspect, both in terms of technology and in terms of attitude. And notice, I mean, modern spirituality is many ways, has pilloried itself to the pillar of severity, to use Kabbalah speak. And what it needs is it needs to learn how to play well with others. And that means individuals need to play well with others. And that means it needs to bring in and move over to the aspect of Netzach, that social Venusian aspect, because we can talk about justice all we want, and bring up the forces of Libra, but that requires emotional maturity. We can talk about the powers of magic and well-being and those forces of stability of Earth, of Taurus, but again, that requires emotional maturity. So we have to mature the whole person. We can't just keep treating occultism as a body of techniques. It's not a body of techniques. It's a view. It's a philosophical view that you apply to everything. And then from that, you as a person are refined. This is about the refinement and the cultivation of the person, which of course goes beyond just our notions of day-to-day living, but expands that to include the metaphysical elements that we so often identify with magic. But if we rush to those metaphysical elements before we engage in the personal refinement, which you see so much today with just a lot of the raw vulgarity and the sniping and the language that goes on. I mean, it's like saying, okay, well, clearly the path between Hod and Netzach has not been crossed because the social engagement, you know, that's pay, the Mars and the screaming mouth. Okay, well, there it is. We need to get adults, people who are willing to act like adults and be adults and take responsibility on and get them into an environment that nurtures that social interaction and encourages social interaction, both through things like Zoom or Skype, but also in person. We need to have more local activities. You know, occultism is ultimately, or esotericism of any kind is ultimately always local.
Yep.
There has to be a social element to it because there aren't enough people who have enough skill sets for everyone to be hermits.
Yeah. And I think, you know, having a strong, that's one of the things about building the strong institutional base, is you have the strong institutional base, which then can feed out into strong local bases on a wider level, right? Because you can have a strong community locally to some extent, you know, but how much stronger is it when you have a strong sort of global institutional sense that can then move into local areas and communities with people who then get together and continue that conversation, you know, with their communities and with people in their communities or regions, you know, I mean.
Well, I can think of a group that did that very well. And they had about 12 or 13 attached groups to them, smaller groups. Each one was very unique in its own way. And they all formed a larger and what appeared to be fairly effective organization. And they did that well. Now, how they are now, I haven't been in contact with them in a while, but when I was, they seemed to be doing very well because they took that approach that there was a hub of the wheel, but there was a wheel.
Right.
And it's like a node. If you want to use the spider web analogy, you've got to have a node. You've got to have something in the center that the rest of that spider web goes off of. And we were working on that prior to about a year or two prior to COVID. We're getting local groups started. But, you know, COVID came along. It was a very difficult year for everyone. So they've kind of fallen on by the wayside. But we want to reinvigorate that and get that going again, where people have access to other people with common knowledge base, which of course this is the instruction the Institute offers, but at the same time, then the ability to speak with other people going along on that path. Because what I find is, with the exception of a few groups, and there a few are left out there, you know, it's very often to run into people on your path, and you're really talking past each other. The words, I've had people walk up to me and use words and phrases as if I'm supposed to know them, you know, and then they end it with a namaste or something like that, or tache deleg or whatever. And it's like, yeah, there's broad assumptions in what those words mean and how we all understand them. And that's where tradition comes in. Even if you study Vajrayana Buddhism or Indian Tantra, even within the individual schools, the same term can have a very different meaning, just as it can in alchemy or Kabbalah. In alchemy, the same word can have very different meanings in its own manuscript, let alone across manuscripts. So when we're looking at communicating, again, that Mercury element, we need to define our terms, and we need to be with other people who are working more or less within the same philosophical constructs the same practical, technical constructs so that we can have access to people for problem solving and learning and sharing. And that's where growth comes in. That's how you're able to nurture the individual. And that's what occultism, esotericism for me has always been. It's about nurturing of the individual. The practices are the means that we do that, but the environment is where that real nurturing takes place, where we apply it. That's
Yeah, and
the
nurturing to protect as well, in some sense. I
yes.
mean, if you're flooded with, and that's the thing with the amount of information that is available today, is being flooded with information, practices, advice, right? I mean, if you go on Facebook, you have how many ads for like different meditation teachers. I mean, it's just like whatever practice, like Reiki, just like a flood of it. And that in a way is dangerous to actually developing anything stable or meaningful, whereas that nurturing sense of a shared conversation allows a sort of protection to happen, from just random influences and whatever happens in practice as well, the actual results of practice.
Well, and that's why it's interesting because we're in the sign of Cancer, which is about that protection, the house of protection. Well, why? So that something can grow inside. And that growing inside under a protected environment is taken very seriously in schools. We don't seem to take that too seriously now. We act as if there's nothing that can hurt us, or that whatever happens, we can deal with it until we can't. And then within that framework, the notion is, then how do you prepare people to then stand on their own? A lot of organizations don't do that. They have, and for different reasons, and some of them are actually quite legitimate. But how do we mature people? How do we help people grow and mature is ultimately what this is about. And whatever rituals we're doing is just a way to add extra juice to that so that we can increase the amount and intensity of experiences we have in our lifetime so that we can bring more out from deep inside of us so that we can challenge ourselves more. And maybe that's an issue that we need to bring up, that many people look to magic, and I think the book, The Secret, is a good reason to why people have this notion that esotericism and magic is to free you of all burdens. That the universe is your catalog and you're to get whatever you want. And while it's good that we strive for things and to build things and to achieve things, it's very important that we do that. The notion of being free of struggle, at least early on, is a bit naive. I mean, all of the great teachers, all of the great esoteric teachers had tremendous burdens. Tremendous. Why should it be any less for their students? Well, the only reason it's less for their students is because the teachers take some of that on, both knowingly and unknowingly. So we have to be honest about what is going to happen when you engage in spiritual practice. And we're really dishonest about that, generally speaking. Maybe it's out of
Yeah.
ignorance, but sometimes I think it's out of, fear of losing the customer base.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too that, again, institutional organization at a strong level and at a mature level, that helps with that process and that guides that process, because then you have the struggle becomes a meaningful struggle as opposed to just sort of flailing, in the mud and not really getting anywhere with it.
Right. It's the difference between going to the gym with a coach who's forcing you because the coach knows that you're going to be competing in a meet or a tournament of some kind at X point in the future and that you need to get ready for it. And that's the way a lot of teachings were done. I mean, it wasn't, in that competitive sense, but the competition was against you, against yourself.
Against the chainsaws in the background, you know. That's, yeah, I think that, and I mean, that with the ease too of, I mean, Amazon shipping, right? And just you can go on and find a book, like you were saying with book piracy. It becomes very easy just to click a button and suddenly it's all there. And I think that everything is leading away from that sense of struggle and sense of meaningful struggle, and that conversation's not being had, which again I think is one of the important aspects of tradition, is to be able to, you know again, not to be flailing in the mud, but to actually frame things in their proper light, right? Like you said, the view, the proper view, and I don't think you get a proper view without having some sort of organization to help authorize that. Otherwise you have the sort of cult of personality, that happens, where it can lead, especially in today's culture, it's very easy for the cult of personality aspects to take over.
Well, I think we see that with, in one of Butler's books, he says about magic, the neophyte is asked, "Why are you here?" And the answer is, "I'm here to serve." And I don't, I, you don't get asked that question when you buy a book,
Right.
and that's okay. But and when we say serve who and what?
Right.
That's why I wrote about in egregores. Well, who are you serving and what and why? What is this, again, trying to understand what is your relationship to others, and that includes all others, that includes all levels of visible and invisible beings. And then with that, what is your obligation? And these are the difficult questions, because when you really seek to undergo that path of inner awakening, of adepthood, really adepthood, you look at the tree of life, all the paths that go off that are unpleasant. So how are you going to deal with that, and how someone is going to help you through that in those periods is very important.
Right.
Sometimes they're vaguely referred to as the dark night of the soul, or aspects of the dark night of the soul, and people think that every time they have a depressive moment, it's the dark night, and it's not. When that strikes, it's a terribly difficult experience.
Right.
And
I
it's
know.
very,
And if
yeah.
just really quickly, like with the Dark Night of the Soul, you think Saint John of the Cross, right? I mean, he's sort of the one who coins that phrase, that particular way of describing that experience, and he's persecuted by the very church that provides the foundation of that passing of that tradition, which he's accepted into through the Dark Night of the Soul. But the organizational structure persecutes him and throws him in jail as a heretic, and he has that experience within that, but then is sanctified right afterwards, and then has that movement through that, and I think that's a very, that isn't, people don't think of that. A lot of people, when they talk about that kind of thing, they're like, oh well, Saint John of the Cross, but Saint John of the Cross was persecuted by the church, and that's part of that moment for him. But at the same time, he's embodying the message of Christ, who was persecuted by, the church essentially in his time, right? I mean, he's persecuted by the priests and the rabbis. He's persecuted by the civil structure, and that is part of that journey, you know. And but without the church to have that structure, not the persecutory structure, but without the church to carry on the tradition, John would have been lost, right? St. John of the Cross would have just been adrift in, whatever. There would never be the structure for him to move through that, move through the very persecution he faced at the institution that brought him the tradition that allowed him to move through it. And that kind of complex thing, if you just grab a book off the shelf and you're just reading it and going about and doing whatever, it doesn't necessarily play out that way. You can just end up destroyed and just, laying in the street.
Yeah, you can, and I think the notion here is the persecution aspect. We see that a lot in esotericism. Uh, we've experienced a tremendous amount of it, and we've seen a lot more over the last few years with people who stray from what is perceived to be some universal ideal. And that persecution is stunning, but it's essential to stand up and just recognize that whenever you're going to do anything worthwhile, there's going to be opposition, and it will almost always come from those closest to you. It's amazing how it often comes from family members, and just unintentionally. They don't even know, just something happens. They just pop a cork for some reason that day. So there's that metaphysical aspect that you need someone to hold your hand through that when that happens. And say, yeah, I understand what you're going through, because that's just the way it goes. But this is important and you have to stick with it. This is the choices, stopping and going back or what have you, or going forward, but those are things that can't really be brought through just in a book. You need good instruction. You need experienced instruction and people to help you through that. But yeah, that's interesting. And the cultists are pretty good at sabotaging each other on that. But that's an example of that, staying focused on Hod and not really moving over into the social aspect, and how do we have social harmony, and
Right.
my not having to be the focal point of it all. You see, that's where the power complexes come in. How do we avoid power complexes in these groups is one of the questions.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's interesting talking about persecution too, just because you had recently posted a photo from a student who's in prison, right? Who's utilizing some of the material to learn and to have that growth, while they're in prison, which isn't going to happen without some sort of community outside, and someone outside the prison to influence in, to help that growth, at which point that person may be talking to other prisoners. I mean, when you're stuck in jail, you have access to a lot of people that are just kind of crammed in there with you, and that those conversations become a lot more meaningful, than people on the outside who have a choice, and that the institutional backing of that kind of outreach is. Important, you know.
Well, that was a very important part of our formation, and it wasn't our choice. Someone thought it was a good idea to put us down as a, prison outreach group on some pagan list a long time ago. And that was fine, but they never asked us. They just did it. They thought it was a good idea, but then it became our responsibility. And we did our best, but we weren't able to really send anything to anyone because we didn't have any money at the time, any resources. And everything had to be bound. You can't send CDs or DVDs or anything. It has to be a printed book, and printed by a publisher, usually something you can get off Amazon now is what they require. So only recently did we suddenly get enough resources from patrons. We asked for them. We told them what we wanted, and they sent the money to make it happen. That we would, send these books to the men and women who ask for them. And we've done, it's very interesting to see how they cycle through. We send a few, and then we send more. We send them a Introduction to Hermeticism's Theory and Practice and a copy of the Liturgy of Hermes. And then we tell them when they're done with that, we'll send them something else. And sometimes we'll send them a copy of Kabbalah for Health and Wellness too. And, some of them are working through the Unfolding the Rose series, and they share the books. I know they do. They tell me about it. And that's what we do. But that takes money and
Right.
time. We have thought, word, and deed. In Zoroastrianism and Judaism and Christianity, thought, word, and deed. And Vajrayana, body, speech, and mind. And what is it in Tantra? It's something, or Indian, it's thought, energy, and action, something like that. But it's all the same thing. You have to do something. Good ideas aren't enough. They have to be backed up by action. And that action means another holy trinity: time, talent, and treasure. It's going to take time. We live in time space. It's going to take time. It's going to take talent, that is abilities of some kind, and it's going to take money. And not just treasure, it used to be more than that, but fundamentally it means cash. How do you get people books? How do you ship them to them? How do you just get to the post office to get it done? All of that is resources. And when you get involved on that level, you're no longer thinking on the level of, as we said, Hod, all that kind of stuff, arguing over this ritual, that ritual, someone stuff. And that's nonsense. What we're looking at then is this picture of Chesed. It's Jupiter. It's Jupiterian. It's a big picture because all these elements come into play. All these people come into play. We're dealing with lots of people and their lives, and whether it's phone calls with prison chaplains or letters with prisoners or other students, all of this takes time and my talent, or the talent of whoever's doing it, that is experience and knowledge and money to make it happen. And we've moved into a notion, because of ease of access, where we don't understand that we're coming to a point where esotericism is bifurcating. And you're going to see a continued increase in occulture, this notion of commonality and stuff and occultism and culture. But you're also going to see people say, I'm done with that, enough of this. And you're going to see more emphasis on effectiveness and practicality. But mostly, what does this do? And you're going to see more high demand teachings, meaning teachings that require more of you and that you, of course, can have a relationship with. But that requires a relationship, for that intensity to be there. You can't have intensity, which is required for the maturation of the individual process, without intensity. You can't get intensity from a book. You can get good instruction. That's why we publish them. But remember, that's a fail-safe for preservation purposes. It's not meant to be a replacement for real human contact and interaction. And even in this kind of interaction, this is very good. We can, in this framework of Zoom, even have some very intense experiences if we're handle it properly. Now, is that a substitute for being in the room? No, but it's sure a lot better than trying to do that by correspondence, or not at all. So we have to look at what is the real purpose here, and what is the real purpose of our teachings, and how is that going to work in practicality for us? Then what is the fruit of that going to be? And then how is that going to spread out to others? And when you talk about spreading beyond yourself, that's when you're, again, and I can't stress this enough, we're talking about moving into an adult relationship with the universe and with others. And that's big picture stuff now. Now you're actively engaging, saying, okay, what can I do? What can I do? What is expected of me? How can I contribute? Because I know I'm going to benefit, but how can I contribute and be of assistance here? Because if this is of value to anyone, any of these teachings, regardless of your organization, your group, your if you have a tradition, if you're in one, if it's of value to you, I always say, well, then do you want others to experience it as well? And most will say yes. Well, if you want others to experience it as well, does that mean you would want this for your children and grandchildren? They say yes. I said, now, do you believe in reincarnation? Oh, almost everyone says yes. I said, well, how are you going to know if these teachings are going to be around for when you reincarnate? Who's going to make sure they're here for you? See, that's what continuity and tradition does. It's really the gift you give yourself into the future in some respects. Right. And we need to think in those terms. You see, that's when you're really thinking in those terms, where the metaphysical aspect has real meaning to you now.
Right. And that's, I think, one of the things that comes out of all the, that comes out of the interaction with others, conversations, having the structure. Because people, when you say that, I'm sure there's a lot of people who believe in reincarnation, right? But they don't live a path that actually follows through with that. you know, and in the sense of knowing that it's going to happen, and making the plans and the steps that it's going to happen. You know, I mean, you have Buddhist termas, right? And yet how, you know, the way, I mean, I see it written about, and it's like the weight of that is doesn't stick, because you, a lot of, you know, talking about arguments over terms, and that a lot of times you'll see people, you know, oh, that's a terma, that's not a terma, or, you know, these kind of like nitpicky and parsing and all the rest of it. Whereas the actual thing itself is exactly what you're describing. It's preparing for that next step. You know, it's preparing for that reincarnation step, right? And to do that takes not parsing terms, live is possible action, you know.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit there, David. I think I get the gist of it, and that's the difference. Traditional spiritual teachings prepare you to die while you are alive. They mean that literally. They prepare you to be able to exist in the, we'll call it astral dimensions, whatever that means, that's spiritual dimensions, while alive and while dead. They're not necessarily concerned with the accumulation of more stuff. That's not to say they don't care about it, because many of the magical techniques are all concerned with very real material concerns. And I think given the time in which they were written, that's reasonable. Your life was pretty much guaranteed to be short, dirty, and brutal. So anything that could make it easier is highly desirable and sought after. But that also meant they had a greater sense of terminality. And we seem to be missing that as we focus so much on whatever is new. You know, what is the new idea? What is the new thing? What is the excitement of the teaching, of the practice? Rather than, what does this do for me while I'm alive? And what will it do for me when I'm dead? And that's the question you have to ask. And why? Why is that important then? Why do you need a teaching that's going to help you when you're dead? And that's where tradition comes in. That's where you get to have a body of teachings and practices and other people who you can begin to understand this very, at times, confusing and complex series of interlocking worlds and dimensions that we exist in and through.
Right. Well, and that, you know, I mean, you think of any strong tradition that's lasted for, you know, I mean, the Catholic Church is a good example. The examples in Buddhism, I mean, any of the major traditions, um, they last because of that, right? They last because of that multidimensionality and that recognition their masters are still living, that those teachings are still alive through that. That's both the institution and the strength of the individual practitioners and the dedication of the people within that group, you know?
Oh, very much. And that's where you have the notion of what is the healthy egregore and the unhealthy egregore, and why is it useful to you, and why do you need to free yourself from them, and at times why do you need to be a part of one. And it's about relationships, you know, in the, what is my relationship, and how is this relationship helping me move to the, in this spiritual sense, we'll say at least the goal of enlightenment, or whatever that is, you know, whatever the goal happens to be, salvation, insight. How does it do that? Well, it isolates and protects me to some degree. Now, you can do the same without an egregore. That's fine. We've often stated that can be done too. But you still have to know what the territory is you're working in. And if you're trying to go this path without an egregore, or a good one, I should say, a healthy one, a traditional one, and you don't have good teachings, you end up worse than if you didn't do anything at all. You know, because there's very real forces or movement. It's just the way it is. It's just the universe we live in. Otherwise, there'd be no growth, right? I mean, there'd be no challenge. Is that we have forces that move us in the direction of awakening and insight, and then we have forces that move us against it, meaning habituated patterns of ignorance and just laziness and all sorts of things, and some which are even worse than that, we can say might be genuinely harmful, malicious, or even evil. Just as we can say there's occasional moments of true saintliness that we may experience. But that's just the universe we live in, and it's okay. But we have to learn how to navigate it. And we have to accept that rather than thinking, you know, this is basically an extension of my entertainment budget, you know, or that a culture, you know, again, the entertainment aspect, or this is just an interesting side thing. I just like it. These practices have to be taken seriously in the sense that we recognize that they have a real effect. They are a cause, which then has a real effect. And we have to understand what those effects are and then benefit from them and recognize that we are in a position where we can then share that with others in some fashion as well. And that those benefits mean, at least as far as we're concerned, greater freedom, greater insight, greater happiness. Not so much that you don't have problems, but you learn how to solve problems, a greater refinement of us as individuals. And the more refined we are as individuals, then the easier it is for us to interact with others.
Right. Well, and I think, you know, one kind of off offbeat example of that is your own work. I'll call it outreach, but I don't know if it's outreach, but I mean, you've gone on the History Channel, right? I mean, you've consulted on that kind of thing, Gaia TV. So you've interacted with these media egregores, you know, or these focal points of sort of the cultural egregore through media. And because of your practice and because of your place within these institutional structures, you can go out and interact at a level, right, that could consume someone else or would, you know, consume the ideas, you know, whereas you can go in, interact there, and there's, you know, there's spiritual dimensions to that, you know, there's occult dimensions to that, especially when you're dealing with, you know, paranormal media and that kind of thing. Like those media outlets have a certain resonance to them, which isn't always, you know, healthy healthy necessarily. No offense to History Channel and Gaia,
Oh
but
no, it's great, but it's true. You can't avoid it, and that's why I don't have any problem talking about it. 'Cause you can't avoid it, and you and I have talked about this often, and I've talked about it with some other folks. Is the temptation to, I guess, what's the phrase? You know, go off the rails.
yeah,
And what that means is the temptation to say or do something that will significantly undermine or even outright destroy your credibility. And you say, well, what do you mean? And it's there. And it increases with the media exposure and the media presence. And it's a very real thing. And again, I believe it's part of the notion that within us, we're doing work. So we have to deal with our own inner problems, right? Our own inner, whatever it is, psychological issues. You know, don't believe your own propaganda. But at the same time, there is qualities that are being nurtured and developed and brought forth in each of us. And to some greater or lesser degree, when someone who is an author or not, or a semi-public figure who's advocating these practices in the manner such as what I am doing, goes out to pretty much, you know, almost like jousting at windmills in some respect, you know, there is a counter against that. There's a counter push. I can tell you stories of what happens before every trip and after every trip.
Yeah.
And you would get it because there's a metaphysical, paranormal aspect to this. And you don't want to make too much of it because that's an inflation, but you don't want to ignore it either. It's just like crossing the street. That's what I tell people. It's like crossing the street, left, right, left.
Yep.
Always look left a second time and then cross. It's with whatever we do. There's a metaphysical dimension to everything we do. The more people we're able to impact by that dimension, then the greater attention we willingly or unwillingly bring to ourselves and our actions. It just, no, this is just cause and effect. There's nothing unusual about it. But people can very easily let it go to their head. They can begin to say, well, I'm persecuted by these evil forces, or, the stories, we've heard them all. And there may or may not be truth to that, but that's just the nature of the game. I mean, that's just what you're doing. That's like a lifeguard complaining because he had to jump in the pool. I mean, it's just what you do. But there's metaphysical aspects to everything we do, and it takes experience to know that. And it's helpful to be around other people who have had those different experiences.
Yeah.
And
To
well,
speak.
we were talking about someone we know personally, who wonderful authority, and yet there was some things that were being said that were like, oh man, be careful there. That's
Yeah.
right on the edge of everything could just get blown out of the water with that statement.
Yeah. 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 And it, as you said, it kind of it goes with the territory in terms of when you're reaching out to that many people, and how it can be interpreted too. There's a responsibility, and I think that it keeps hitting on that responsibility aspect, in all these different ways. But the responsibility in your actions to have that level of care when you have these kind of conversations, and when you know other people, right, that have varying levels of responsibility, higher and lower, and you can interact with that and converse with that, who are also of a similar view, who also are sharing a practice and sharing practices,
Mm-hmm.
and have this kind of this concept, this
But
cosmology.
because you're going to have that individually. You notice whenever you do something like you got a good project, you want to get a new job, you want to open a new business, you want to have a career change, you think that the people close to you are going to support you, and they're the ones who just are trying to dissuade you from it.
Right.
It's the same process. So it's not like unique to, it's just different. It's
Right.
just a different way of it happening to each of us. So and when you have a good community of practitioners to be with, whether you can meet with them physically or meet with them virtually, when those things get shared, like we do in our question and answer session twice a month, it helps people decompress and process a lot of their experiences that otherwise they would have trouble with.
Right.
That's why I'm such an advocate of some level of group work and interaction. It's for the personal refinement part, and that ability to uh, really understand yourself and what you're going through and what your experiences are.
Right. And like you say, in terms of decompressing, to to take some of the ego out of it, to take some of that like self-focus out of it. When you recognize that someone else has gone through it, when you recognize someone else may have the answer, to the thing, it takes that I'm being persecuted by, the forces of darkness and I'm a superhero kind of idea out of it, and it becomes much more human and much more,
Exactly. This is just part of the process. And that's why when I wrote the book, Pathology of the Sublime, it was because I was seeing all these things happen, but they were patterns. They were predictable patterns. And I see them again and again and again. So I just started taking notes, and that's why the monograph came about. But that's also part of why this bifurcation is taking place, that we're going to see it get wider and wider with we're going to see it get wider and wider with people who want more from their practice. And of course that means they have to be willing to commit more. And I jokingly say, Amork, the Rosicrucian Order Amork used to have this ad, uh, you can be a member of the order, and for only an hour a week in the privacy of your home. And we used to jokingly say, those of us who say, yeah, well, you can be a dues paying member for an hour a week, but you're going to get a lot more out of it if it's an hour a day,
Yeah.
and then maybe come to a lodge meeting once or twice a month. Oh, and then by the way, maybe do this too. Yeah, so it's about what you want to put into it and what you're able to put into it at different phases of your life, different stages of your life. So, when we set up the teaching schedule for the Institute for Medic Studies, the question was, were we going to look at traditional methods of ritual practice and initiation? And if so, then how do we do it? Do we write our own? And a lot of that just said we had done that, but we weren't going to do it anymore, or at least I shouldn't say that. We weren't going to do it this time because we were looking at the teachable platform, and decided to organize everything around what people were familiar with. And that is kind of a school or college structure, and really college like, because that way you can come and you can take a class, which is what you can do, or you can take a course of study. You can take a class and go home, or you can take a class or a course of study and participate with others. So we do provide a kind of Chinese menu approach, if you want to call it that, or look at it. Is it preferred? No, it's not my preferred way of doing things. Does it fit the time and place we're in now? Yes. Does it allow people to sample what we have? Of course, Unfolding the Rose is 6 hours of teachings and it's free. So yes, you can sample what we have. If you want to, you can become more involved with what we do at your choice. But as people become more involved, this is where things shift. This is where it becomes more traditional. More is expected of them. But they're told that, so it's not a surprise. And then they benefit more from it. The more you do, the more you benefit. It's like anything. And I think within structures, we need to see more of that. Freemasonry is a very good example. Freemasonry, we've been calling its death for 20 years now, and it lingers on life support. But there are areas of Masonry that have made a tremendous resurgence, and that's traditional observance Masonry. Why? Because it's high demand. And you see that in anything. Well, there's a tendency in society right now, and this is counterproductive to everything we do, to lower demand, to lower requirements. We see that a lot in education and ways that are just shocking. But at the same time, we see that the organizations and institutions and practices and people that require more, they get a great deal more attention. That was kind of the secret behind Joe Leshevsky. People like one of the things is, I remember we were talking years ago, and he said, well, just they want to be yelled at. They want someone to tell them what to do, and I won't use his language. Okay. But essentially, I'll be polite and say, straighten up and fly right. And this is what you got to do. And if you don't do it, don't call me. Think that your time starts at 9 o'clock, not 10 after 9. Be on time, be prepared. I mean, these are just adult things.
Yep.
And that's what made him very popular with a lot of his students. And I see that with a lot of the young men, and young men, unfortunately, means guys between the ages of 18 and almost 40, who I see a lot of them who come to me for stuff that really they should have already have learned about, how to be responsible, how to take care of things, how to mature and be effective in their lives. Now, we want to be effective. That's why, again, we come to occultism. We're disaffected with our life. That's the secret, right? We're not happy. And we want this to help make us happy, which is okay. This is fine. That's what spirituality is to help us do, help us find joy and happiness. But to do that is unfortunately going to take work and effort and difficult. And you usually need someone to help you hold your hand, and sometimes not hold your hand, but drag you by the ear to get your work done. And that's the way it was traditionally done. And for the most part, it's not anymore. And that's the problem. We need to have more of that traditional method. But that means students also have to be able to identify what is a healthy teaching and a healthy teacher from an unhealthy one. And that can be very subjective.
Yeah, and I have trust too.
Trust.
You know, a trusting relationship that you know that the other person isn't just doing it for their own gratification, but it does actually have, something behind it, you know?
Exactly. And I've had to warn some folks I know well about that, that I see some uh, teachers, up and coming celebrity teachers who I've spoken to, and say, you got to be careful here. Don't realize that everyone's at a different point in their life than you are. What you consider required practice of 2 or 3 hours a day may not be possible for them. What can they do in their 45 minutes a day? What can they do in their hour a day? You have to really get into their situation and address what they're capable of and then move them forward. And that takes a great deal of pressure or patience. There's no cookie cutter model for that. And that's something you only get with experience of dealing with a lot of people.
Yeah. Which, again, doesn't happen without that sort of institutional base. I mean, it
Again,
really doesn't. You don't have that kind of community, because you need the community, and the community needs a house. I mean, the community has to have a place to go. It needs a neighborhood. It needs a structure to work within.
well, and that's why I firmly believe that you're going to see an increased desire for local activity. But here's the thing, that activity needs to be institutionalized, probably in more ways than one, right? But that institutionalization means it can't be in someone's basement or in their attic or in their garage, because the golden rule is always at work. And that's the initiate of Tiferet, the solar initiate always knows the golden rule. And that is, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And on the flip side, it says, he who has the gold makes the rules. So you had better hope that whoever has the gold and is making the rules because it's in their house, so they own it, is treating you according to the other side. Doing unto you the way they would, treating you the way they would want to be treated. So that's the part about relationships. How much responsibility and burden are we putting on really a few people? And then what is the pathological response to that pressure? Because there is a pathological response to that pressure when the responsibility or sense of responsibility of the continuity of this, it has fallen on your shoulders or a small group of shoulders. If we truly want this to be democratic, that means many hands lighten the load, and that means many hands have to be involved for real. And that's, again, sharing of the responsibility. That's why these groups were always so small. Again, going back to the Golden Dawn, 350 people in it at its high point. You look at the numbers of the French Martinist groups, they're very small. Look at the numbers of the El Cohen. I mean, that's like a mythic French order that, 20 years ago, there was almost nothing in English about. Now you've got their rituals have been published in gourmet editions that you can get for $50 to $100. But you look at how many people were in it at the time, it was very few.
Right.
It was people with means and ability and time. So, and then what happened when the revolution came and most of them died or scattered? It just, disappeared. So again, continuity means involvement on all levels. Across generations. And that's what we're working on at the Institute now. And that's where our fundraiser comes in. Because the notion here is that we need money to do things, and we're going to need it in the future. And the way institutions do that is through endowments. You get as much money as you can from as many people as you can, and you invest it. Now, most people don't understand investment. You know that, and I do. They don't really plan for the future, think that far ahead, but you have to. And we're looking to raise, at this point, $25,000, which people go, oh, that's the price of a used car. Okay, let's keep this in perspective. And you don't spend that, you invest that, and cross your fingers like everyone else and hope that it grows at 3 to 5% or 6% a year ad infinitum. And that will then at some point, 5 to 8 or 9 or 10 years from now, then generate enough interest income where you can do something with it. But you see, that's two things. That's Jupiter, meaning the plan. And of course, what's the plan? And then that's Saturn, time. You have to be patient and wait for the plan to work. But that means you have to do it at the right time.
Right.
The best time to do this is always 20 years ago. The second best time is now.
Right.
So we have to do this so that 10 years from now, we're going to have at least enough interest income to what? To basically what we can do with that is guarantee that we can have our conference every year.
Right.
Because conferences are expensive and they're only going to continue to be expensive to produce.
Right.
Especially if we're doing them in person.
Yeah, and the in-person, all the benefits of the organization come from the stability that an endowment would allow, right? We sort of joked about parapsychology earlier, but the only reason that people know about parapsychology now is, after funding has dropped out and after public interest in large part has dropped out for a number of years, decades, um, is because of endowments, right?
Well, it's the same with the Theosophical Society. The only reason a Theosophical Society is because people put a lot of money into it a century ago. And the same thing with Amorc in many ways. They had lodges in many places. Why? Because men and women got up and they signed the mortgage on those. You had 12 or 15 men and women who agreed to pay the mortgage on the building.
Right.
I need that needs to sink in. That's the level of commitment and devotion and dedication our grandparents, great grandparents, and great great grandparents had to sending this message forward for us. And we need to have that same dedication. I just heard of someone the other day, and this is nothing. They're going to raise $125,000 for a Buddhist center up in New Hampshire on someone else's property. They're going to donate the property. That's like nothing to them. 125,000, no problem. Okay, so they're going to be around probably in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. The question is, what aspects of Western esotericism will be around in 30 years? And I can tell you, those with the most money. That's Jupiter. No? And if you want books, that's Mercury. If you want your private library, that's Mercury. If you want internet stuff, well, that's Mercury. But that just comes and goes. If you want long-term vision, that's Jupiter. That's going to be interacting with other people. That's Venus. That's being able to be a focal and suitable problem solver, someone who can be relied upon. That's the Sun. And you're going to put some energy behind it. That's Mars. And you're going to know that you only have so much time to do it and that you have limits because you're going to die. So you got to get this done. That's Saturn. I mean, that is the reality of the framework we're working in. And that's a hard sell to people. But we can't sugarcoat this. And that's what we need to do. We need to say, what are we providing for our children and grandchildren? I think if we can provide for our grandchildren, they can figure out for the next generation or two. But what are we building for ourselves to come back to so that we can finish this work, this great work? We need to think in that framework. That's the only framework that's going to give us sustainability and continuity.
A friend of mine who's been doing some sort of independent scholarship on lodges, not Masonic lodges necessarily, but different lodges of organizations and societies that have existed, say 19th century to now, and the level of community involvement that they had, the level of influence that they had, and like you said, paying a mortgage on buildings, which may still be named for the lodge, right? There were labor lodges that were, you know, sort of like a mix of a sort of like quasi masonry and unionism. Um, those buildings still exist. They're still recognized as having been that, right? And most people don't know that that ever happened. Most people in society don't see that, you know. But everybody wonders why things were why things ran a little bit better at certain points in time, right? And it was because of the kind of attitude that you're talking about, where, you know, these groups, I mean, you look at um, so much of culture has come out of these kind of organizations organizing quietly, because that's the work. You know, the occult work is quiet. It's not this public display. Um, but it's still there, you know. And then but then having that community and that sense of community and that action that then goes out and spreads out and creates order and creates stability around that, you know. And that's the full breath, you know, as you're talking about the full breath in the individual, like what do we need to move forward, right? The full alignment of planetary influences or Kabbalistic influences, right? In the same sense that that then starts to feed out to communities that are organized, you know, and societies that are organized, and everybody has a complaint about society falling apart. And yet, you know, if we don't take these steps now, right, like to organize this, then it doesn't happen. It just continues to sort of fall apart.
You know, and having been a part of lodges that had been around for 100 years or more, I can tell you there's an institutional memory there that is quite fascinating. That you get, and having been part of, you know, of course, my own family and the family tradition there is one thing. That's one aspect that is interesting. But the being a part of a group, you know, people that knowing that you're not the first here and you're not the last. You're part of this effect of this in this chain in some way, in a helpful manner, and there's a responsibility to that. And seeing what happens when that responsibility, when there's failure of leadership, you know, when that happens. Uh, so we have to decide, you know, where are we going to go on this? Because the current occult community, for the most part, is being shaped by popular culture. It is not shaping it. And if esotericism is to have any value, it has to take on that great Renaissance inspiration, where esotericism, Hermeticism shaped the Renaissance. It was the Renaissance. We need that Hermetic revival. We need that Hermetic renewal, where we shape culture for the better and direct it for the better. And that's going to take place in wood and glass and stone, as well as paper, not just, you know, in computer chips and internet, because that's going to be part of it, but that cannot be all of it. We have to get out of the virtual and into the real. And that real means both in terms of the tangible physical dimensions and the real in terms of the absolute. What is the absolute? And of course, which is that transcendent experience. But institutions on some level are required for that. There has to be a focal point around which things move around and gather, so that, again, we gather the energies into us and we send them back out. We gather them into us, we send them back out. You know, we don't just keep moving around. You know, in and out. And with that, things expand and grow. So that's, you know, why we're saying we need this as the first step. We need this money as the first step so that we can guarantee that we can, at the bare minimum, have sufficient resources set aside where we can continue these conferences on ad infinitum. Oh, I think about that. Just think about that. We've done, was it 4 of them now? We're looking at our 5th one, and we're saying we want to be able to have resources to have conferences 15 and 20 years from now. I mean, that's what it takes.
Right. And to be able to have conferences too. I mean, it's hard to explain what it means when you say holding a conference is expensive, right? I mean, that's rent on some facility that you're going to have the conference at. That's catering, right? If you're going to do a full conference, that's catering for at least the people who are speaking, if not the full catering for the full thing. It's catering to some extent, whether it's
Mhm.
coffee or how far you want to go with that, right? It's at the highest level of holding a conference, you're flying people in
Mhm.
from wherever, you're booking them a hotel, you know, you're then also in some sense maintaining them, so travel from the hotel to the conference center if it's not at the conference. I mean, there's so much that goes into that logistically, people to run it, and you can do it, at varying levels. You can cut some of those things out. Folks can fly themselves in, or whatever, but all of it takes time, it takes money, and it takes focus, and that having the ability to do that then also allows you to bring people together for this kind of community, that we're talking about and have been talking about on a higher level. I know that when I go to a conference to speak, you're talking to other speakers that you may not normally have interacted with. New relationships are built, friendships are made, and this conversation continues and then spreads out. I mean, there's people that I've met at conferences that I work very closely with now, that I wouldn't have even known at all, or had any influence, have no connection to their work, had it not been for meeting them at the conference and having that kind of, conversation, both in terms of attending a conference and speaking at it.
Right. And here we're talking about as presenters. What that means to attendees is the ability to meet what are essentially vetted or semi-vetted people who are going to be, in theory, influencing them on their spiritual path.
Right.
And let's root it back to that. We're not talking about, something that is insignificant.
Right.
That this is in theory going to be assisting them on their path of their becoming. And with that, possibly the ability to meet or other people, and get an introduction to some of those groups and organizations that they'd like to. At our other when we were meeting live, we had the public conference, and then before and after we had events lined up, and we were assisting some organizations in their initiations, meaning providing space and a mechanism and a time place for that meeting to take place. It doesn't mean we were involved with it. It just means that that was something we knew was useful and good, and we provided that mechanism for that to take place. So they're kind of on the second, third tier of relationship, meaning that if someone is interested in that line of study or that course of action, we'd say, okay, well, we know some people you can trust.
Right.
And getting back to that trust, I think it's interesting, because we are talking about spiritual development here, and it's funny, people will write to me and ask me all sorts of deep questions that are in theory meaningful to their lives, and other teachers too. And then we say, you're going to trust me with your consciousness, you're going to trust me with your soul, but trust us with $20 that we can invest it properly for something. And it's like, you think you're asking for their children, or this notion of responsibility needs to be really brought home. We're not doing this for you. We don't like you enough. It's not that personal. We don't love you enough. It's not all. It's about you in the collective sense. You as, yes, an individual, we're helping, but you're the one who's come to the table. If it was someone else, we'd be helping them. You have brought yourself to this table. You bring yourself away from it. You stay. That's why it's about you. But if it was someone else, it'd be someone else at the table. How do we develop that relationship of responsibility and the ability to respond to each other when the crises of development take place within the lodge, as they inevitably always will and do, when the crisis takes place within the group, or within your family. A lot of the stuff I get is people who are having problems in their families because they think because of their spiritual practice, and to some degree that's true. Crises come up more readily, more easily. There's many things involved in this that people don't see. And I think it's important that we talk about them. I think it's very important that we talk about them, that we not sugarcoat any of this, so that we can move forward and develop as human beings in a manner that is beneficial to as many beings as possible, not just human beings, but as many beings as possible. Because in our metaphysical dimensions, we're developing relationships with invisible forces. So if you're having trouble with having at least reasonable relationships with the people around you, I mean, reasonable, then imagine where the filters aren't there. Imagine what that's like if you're trying to have relationships with invisible beings.
Right. Which again, I mean, that comes down to the conversations, trust, and communication too, because that's a reality that happens in practice. And I write a lot within parapsychology and sort of paranormal culture, coming from a different angle on it. And so I get people asking me questions about synchronicities, coincidences, encounters with apparitional figures and that kind of thing. And the ability to deal with those experiences and not lose yourself in them, or lose yourself in the glamour of that, or lose yourself in the mythology of it and the sort of the narrative of those things. It's important to be able to have a strong spiritual community that you can interact with, and a tradition that you can interact with that keeps you stable in that, where it doesn't become, and it's the question of the you, right? Because people think that they're special because they had a synchronicity, and it's like, that's the way the world works.
Yeah.
Like, that's just you're like, that's life, right? Like, synchronicities happen. Like, this isn't, you haven't been chosen by, to be the culture hero of the time. Like, synchronicity.
I got that imbued into me early from my great uncle, who used to talk about like funny experiences that he had with folks back in the spiritualist days.
Right.
The joke was that every time the chandelier would jingle from a truck going by, you'd say, well, the masters are communicating with us, someone would say. But that's, I think Dale Graff called that the sanity buddy. You've got to have a sanity buddy. And this goes back to the threefold. It's teacher, teachings, and community of practitioners. Who is the teacher? What are the teachings, and what is the community of practitioners? These are the three things that are essential. And that the community may or may not be widespread, but it is a community. And it's the ability to interact with people who can help you, and who you in turn have a responsibility to help as well.
Right.
And that's essential. And if the world is a beautiful place and wonderful and everything goes well, then if that community is far widespread, that's great. If things go into cyclic downturns, as they often do, and then come back again, isn't it nice to have people locally who you can communicate with, even if it's just once or twice or 3 or 4 times a year, to know that you have a group of practitioners who you can communicate with and understand with, and then communicate through other means. And that's where conferences come in too, that ability to get together once or so times a year with people who you really can speak the same language to. But beyond the conference, of course, we have other projects that we're working on. But that's the starting point. It's not the end point. This is just the thing that we're announcing and why we're doing it, and what the reasoning is. When you look at all the things that we've accomplished over the last 20 years, it's quite a bit. But to keep that going is going to require more people. And to help train those people, refine them is the word, refine them, so that they can take on, whatever duties and obligations they feel is suitable for them. We have people who do the newsletter. We have someone who now helps out with the conference and has done a tremendous job. But, it takes more and more people to do more and more. Hopefully we're going to get someone who can just, take care of the mailing of the books to the prisoners. But, people, they like me to sign them. So I sign them and they enjoy that. So that tends to fall to me. But each one of those things is something that adds up. And there's only so much time in our lives. And it's with an organization too. There's only so much time. So where do we see the Institute heading over the next 20 years? That's the question. And we want to see a broader student base. We would like more members involved with the virtual classes, but we also want to see more of those members, those students involved, forming local groups. And they can tell us what they're doing. We're not going to dictate to them what they do, but, where they can do if they have the basic coursework down, then they can do some experimental work. If they have the basic coursework that we've provided down, then they can communicate some of that experimentation to others. That's what happened at Philosophers of Nature. As you know, I ran the Occult Research and Applications Project. And that was fantastic. There were people who ran the Labora project. That was the laboratory alchemy one. And then there was someone who ran the entrainment, the technology entrainment project, and with research on that. Some great stuff came out of that. Fantastic stuff. And we're keeping that going in a way. In fact, my book, Between the Gates, essentially was a result of most of the research that had occurred in that time.
Right.
And now, that defined what I did for 20 years and still does.
Well, as you're talking about this, I think something to bring up, and this is because of the current culture. Folks are used to getting things sold to them, buying it and taking it home, and that's it. That's the relationship that people expect from a spiritual tradition these days. You know, Someone sells them something, they buy it, and that's the exchange. And what the institute is representing is an actual body of practice, an actual conversation, an actual, not a sales pitch from, a spiritual organization. And I think that that's something that's really unique in terms of what you see in the current climate. Because
Well, I'm a pretty terrible salesman in that regard, because if anything, I'm trying to dissuade you from things.
right,
We when we have volunteers, I always ask the volunteer, well, I'm glad you're here, but what is it that you would like from this experience? And they often look at me like, what? I said, well, you're here to get something. What is it? Oh, I'm not here to get anything. I'm here to help. No, you're here to get something. What is it that you want? Because if you tell me, then I can make sure that you get it. And then usually I went on, oh, well, I'd really like to have more experience in this. Okay, well, that's fine. And the reason I say that is because, I cut my teeth in public speaking from the organizations I was in back in the day. I learned how to do public speaking that way. I certainly didn't learn it in college. I learned it from being with people. I learned organizational skills from being in groups. All of that came from that experience. And that was very practical and useful in other areas of my life. But with that, you begin to apply a notion of the esoteric view. Why am I doing this? When we say a labor of love, what do we mean? What is that so-called karma yoga aspect that you're doing? That's, for lack of a better term. How is this service that I'm doing? And then, of course, the ego comes up, or ego is the wrong word. Sense of self-importance comes up, or the desire to be important comes up. Well, great, because it's going to come up anyhow. It's good at least that it comes up there, where it can be identified and dealt with within that framework, where there's going to be a little more understanding of it. Whereas when it happens at work, there's not going to be a whole lot of understanding.
right.
But that's a big responsibility that is taken on within the framework of those groups. So, or making the commitment, learning how to not commit, and learning how to say no, stop overextending yourself. That's one of the things I do with volunteers a lot, is I say, I want a commitment you can keep. Because if you make one you can't keep, not only do you feel bad about it, but then it's destructive to our relationship, because then I can't trust you in the future. But more importantly, even more importantly, it's destructive to your self-confidence. And self-confidence is the basis of spiritual work. You have to believe that it is possible and that you can do it.
Right.
So you see how this ties together. It's not, they're not separate. You know, we're tying all the pieces together here
Right.
for the refinement of the individual. But that takes a relationship, a commitment
Right.
over time.
And in that way too, I mean, the endowment almost becomes a talismanic act in a certain sense. You
It
know?
is an affirmation of confidence in the future.
Yeah. And that sense of solidifying that relationship over time, you know, and that in a very real, concrete action, you know, which is an interest because it's also the growth of the IHS in terms of an organization to set that up. It's the next stage, you know. I mean, it's growing into a future maturity of its own, you know.
Right. Well, think about how many occultists are out there who are, we know them, we love them, uh, yet they're fundamentally pretty negative people. They're pessimistic. They're quite certain about things going wrong. um, stuff happens. We have to adapt and we have to deal with it. But it's surprising how many of them are using all of their knowledge of the mind against themselves, to not create, to not do. We're saying the opposite: create and do. From the karma perspective, the act perspective, I said to someone, look, I'm not here to convince anyone to do anything. I'm just, since you've brought it up, I'm going to explain it to you as someone I knew personally. I said, we're going to do this and we're going to raise the money, we're going to invest it. And the idea is so that down the road, there's money for these activities and events, and we're going to go for more. We're going to build even bigger stuff because that's just what we're going to do. Because why not? That's the first reason. Why not? I'm alive, and it's something I want to do. And I see it of value to myself and into the future. But let's assume the worst happens, and all of this is built and then comes to naught for some reason of some catastrophe or economic cataclysm. Who knows? Figure it out. Figure whatever the new doom and gloom of choice is, right? It happens. Well, then what? Well, then it didn't matter, because at least I know I did it. Our job is to, if we're to be masters of our world, that means taking our inner world and projecting it into the outer world. That's what the adept does. They control their outer world to some degree as a reflection of their inner world. Otherwise, what's all this talk about transformation and psychokinesis? Why talk about it at all? That's just nonsense then. If there's no projection from the inner to the outer.
Right.
And the other thing is, at least in having done it, I've demonstrated my capacity. And those who've helped have demonstrated their capacity too. And we have forged a relationship that will exist in the future. So through the work that I've done and people that I know and have worked with and some close to me, and I would include my wife in this, and maybe to some degree my children, who knows, that's a different karmic act. But from the tremendous sacrifices made, I have no question, I would even use the word demanding teaching in the future. No problem, no question at all. I've paid my dues.
Yeah.
Time for the next step. And I can say that. I know people who I've said to them, I said, it doesn't matter. We'll probably be together in the future, regardless of what happens. Because that's the relationships of people. And you can choose those relationships in a healthy way to move forward towards your freedom and your enlightenment, or you can just let them happen. But either way, it's going to happen. So the choice is yours.
Right.
So why not build something and put something together for our grandchildren?
And I think too, along those lines, something that was brought up in a conversation that we'd had before this was the idea that there are other organizations that are building their future in that way
Mm-hmm.
and have their own goals for where culture's going and where society's going. And in terms of the idea of refining individuals in that, there's very materialistic, anti-esoteric, that are working to foster a very myopic view of what it means to be alive and what it means to, exist in the world. And they're working to build their organization very successfully. A lot of skeptical organizations in that, who claim to be rational and claim to be bastions of enlightenment and the rest of it, when in reality their worldview is very myopic, and they'll stick around. They they have the funding and they have the institutional clout to carry on.
Well, there again, he who has the gold makes the rules. It's that simple.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if you have to put, as we say, your money where your mouth is. So I ask the questions to anyone listening. Are esoteric teachings important to you? Do you believe that they're beneficial to your life now and in the future and in after death? If so, is this something you wish to share with others? Is this something you desire for your children or your grandchildren? Do you believe in reincarnation? If yes, is this something that you desire to use or study in the future? And if the answer is yes, how is that going to happen? Through what mechanism will you magically come in contact with these teachings again, if you have not provided any means or mechanism for them to exist into the future right now? It's really that simple. Now, that's a terrible sales speech. I'm not a good salesman, but occultism, or should we say spirituality, is about cutting to the chase about truth. And that's the reality as it is. That's why we encourage and invite everyone to come and help us, and we will assist them. We've often extended much support to other organizations and movements, even if it's not recognized. And we've done a lot to help other groups, and gladly will, because we think this is an effective model. And in fact, the more organizations that adopt a model like this, meaning high demand, are going to be a lot happier. Yeah, they're going to have fewer members, but they're going to have better members. Yeah. Or they're going to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different members better, so that they can find the appropriate place for them within the teachings and the organizational structure. And I have a friend who, he's a spectacular ceremonial magician, but he refuses any initiations beyond the grades in his lodge. He says, look, I love it. It's great. They keep begging him. Why? Because he knows they want to move him further up. He doesn't want to do it. He just wants to come and play the officerial role that he has, the ceremonial role, which he does spectacularly, and that's it. Okay, but when you see that in someone, you need to culture that, and you have to and bring it forth and maintain that relationship, and say to others, you see, not everyone has to go through to Adeptus Minor. Yeah, we'd love it if you did, but there's a place for everyone who is dedicated here. And how does that dedication work, and how does that manifest itself? Everyone can have a role if you look for it. But then you have to let them know, this is the role we need you to fulfill, because that's kind of where the opening is. That's part of the service part. When someone says, I want to serve, and you tell them, well, I need you to wash the dishes, you got to go wash the dishes now. And that's part of the growth process too. How do we do both the inner work and the outer work together? How do we do both the glory work and the not so glorious work, together? And that's what groups help. And we like to help other groups too. And again, the more that have high demand relationships, they're the ones who are going to prosper into the future. Those are the ones that you're going to hear more of. They're going to have stability. Right. I don't know, what time is it? How long have we been going?
It is 8:50, so
Is it?
yeah, it's
Wow. Hey,
2 hours. So.
maybe, you know what? Let's just open this up maybe to some question and answer. Maybe I could unmute people and we'll trust them to not, speak over each other. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah, let's open.
Yeah, hey, let's try that. Wow, guys. Let me participants. Okay. Okay.
I've got a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Or comment. This has been a wonderful dialogue that we're having, and sustainability has always been, in my professional life, working with nonprofits, something that is very important. I came into occultism at my first Saturn return, and now I'm at my second Saturn return. And over the time period that's gone by, what kind of advice would you give people who are now coming to the path? Because I think discernment in teachers is really important. And 25 years ago, you could see lots of teachers in person, but now things are different. And I think, David, you mentioned in the very beginning, you'll see people with these really slick websites. It's different these days. What advice would you give to people who are coming to the path about how to find a good teacher?
In terms of the slick websites, I would say that would be one thing to avoid, to avoid. That might be, good teaching doesn't always come with marketable aesthetics. I think that you really, if you're attracted to the outer kind of shell of it, be careful. I would say that would be a sign of taking care. I mean, things can be beautiful. A cathedral can be beautiful in that, but there's a certain danger in doing that now, especially now with the way that media is, and with the way that the focus is so much on the surface.
I think the big one is clarity, the ability to have a face-to-face discussion with the teacher privately, and for even a few minutes, and to clearly understand what is expected of you and what you can expect in return. And using common sense. I can think of an organization that is very good. It started with the best of intentions and still has the best of intentions, and it's very good. And I never heard a complaint at all about their teachings. Every complaint I heard was about it taking 3 to 6 months to get a reply to a question about the coursework in an email. Well, of course it did. I mean, it was all run by volunteers who had lives and jobs. What did you expect for a $65 class? Really, what did you expect? I mean, that's where the common sense drops away. Would you be available, to answer every question, within a 24 or 48-hour period that came to you from these students? So what happens is you get burnout. You get volunteer burnout. So, you pay attention to the teacher, but you pay attention to the volunteers too. What are they like? How long have they been there? How do they treat one another? How do they talk to one another in front of the potential new students or members? Those are the kind of things to look out for, because it may be a great organization, but then you may know, okay, well, that's the person I need to avoid. I'm going to come for the teaching and the relationship with the teacher, but I know that I've got to avoid that one over there, because there's people involved, and you don't always get the best volunteers that you want. You just get who you have. So it's complex. Again, the teacher, the teachings, and then the practitioners. So I would say get a decent sense. Are you comfortable with most of the students? Is also a good thing. Are you comfortable with most of them? No, you can't be with all of them, but at least enough of them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's good guidance. I think discernment is and clarity, both of those are undervalued sometimes today. We're looking for glitz and glamour and instant gratification. And working with esoteric teachings is something that takes years, and people don't have the patience necessarily. They want some instant results.
And they're sold that that will be the case too. Discernment or discrimination is the first virtue of the path that you have to learn. It's the first one. And essentially that means that you understand to some degree cause and effect. That if this, then that. Karma. If this, then that. What is the result? And when you begin to create situations where you're telling people that actions don't have consequences, and they're seeing that there's really no consequences immediately to their poor choices, then it can be very difficult to get them to want to undertake an esoteric path, because people come to esotericism out of suffering. You have to recognize that. You generally don't come because things are good. You come because things are bad. You're suffering and you want that suffering relieved.
Thank you. Yep.
Anyone else? Come on. Any other questions? Let's see. Probably if you want, you can unmute and ask directly. Let me see what we have here. A question on teachings and traditions. Major religions have strong and lasting traditions and often mystical paths. However, the mystical schools of many religions are inaccessible due to orthodox. I went too fast. Are inaccessible due to orthodoxy and, as you have said, very high demands on students becoming a monk or rabbi. What guidance would you give on how to balance or bridge engaging traditional religions with more accessible paths to mysticism, which often draw from major religious traditions? I think that's a tricky one, because now you're reaching into the area of traditionalism, which is getting a bit of a bad rap by many these days. But it is a good place to start. And I think, for example, if someone is very devoted to, a Christian path, a simple book such as Meditations on the Tarot is a lifetime of study. I have people who work with that almost exclusively because it's just a spectacular work. And you don't have to belong to anything or do anything other than study the book. And then within that same framework, you can move into Martinism if you like. There are different Martinist schools, which are very good. And then just kind of stay there. Don't feel the need to move into like a lot of the Knight Templar stuff or some of the other groups that spawn off that can be enough. If your orthodoxy is what you're interested in, of course, there's a lot of rich Orthodox mysticism that you can stay with. I'm not too familiar. I've seen a little bit of it, and I don't think there's much in English. I could be wrong. There is a rich tradition of some occultism within Orthodoxy, but it tends to be very local, very kind of folkish. So it will fall within the framework of, is it Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, that kind of thing. The same way you see with a lot of magical traditions within Buddhism. They're actually local magical traditions that have a Buddhist gloss. So you have some of those frameworks to deal with. But within the Protestant framework, you would then have to look at Quakerism, which is really is a mystical tradition in many ways, or the various pietist groups. And some of them continue to exist. And I do have for better or worse, an official connection to them. And then that takes you into the teachings of Jacob Boehme, who of course cycles us back into Martinism once again. So Swedenborg and Böhme and back to Martinism again. So that's kind of a good place to go. Is that helpful for you? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and with that too, I mean, if you go to like Burma, you have William Law, right, whose serious call to a devout and holy life is a Protestant classic that would be accepted in any church. You could walk into any evangelical church or, Protestant church with that book and not be questioned. But what William Law was doing, William Law translated Burma's work into English. And A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life is his manual on how to practice the practices, not necessarily the metaphysical view, and that expands through Burma's work, but the practices of just quietness, prayer, focus, that kind of thing, and how to interpret some of the symbolism within the Bible in a way that turns it into a practice as opposed to just kind of rote orthodox repetition or a belief. So there's little avenues that you can find, I think, and stay completely orthodox and not offend anyone and still have access to those things. And then, as you were saying, Mark, there's also avenues that you can go deeper into esoteric or occult practice that are, for all intents and purposes, maintain some form of orthodoxy.
The question here follows up. I'm thinking of Judaism specifically, though it's helpful to hear the generalizations. I think the question here within Judaism is that you have, to my knowledge, which is imperfect, quite a few schools of Jewish Kabbalah, which are very different from one another. And you're simply going to have to find someone who you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to work directly with a teacher, for whatever reason, you're going to have to find a mechanism of getting that additional information, because the different schools are very subtle in their differences, and they can be amazingly different from what we think of as Western magical Hermetic Kabbalah. Can be some very profound differences. So if you find someone, maybe it's you're just going to have to just deal with the orthodoxy for a while, depending on how severe that is. What does that translate into real terms? Okay. Let's see. Here in the gems. Thank you. Opportunity for growth. Yeah, good. You're welcome. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, well, we will not push you for questions. It has been a very long session, far longer than I expected, but it seems to have gone well. I hope that I was actually speaking to you there, and David as well, that it wasn't just names on a screen and that you've wandered off on our Zoomcast. But I want to thank you all for coming this evening and participating. It's been very important for us to have this conversation, and I encourage you, please, if you're not already involved with the Institute, to get involved, to look at the programs that we're doing, and ask yourself, what am I doing? What can I do to make these teachings available to my children, my grandchildren, and to move this forward into the future, a future that I want to see and be a part of building. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you very much and good night. And thank you, David, so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
And maybe stay on after we're done recording and we say goodbye to everyone. So thank you, everyone. Good night.